So they had their first debate, and what were some of the issues? You were there. What were some of the issues that came up?
Well, I wasn't really there. I was in the green room. We weren't allowed into the place where the debate happened, but suffice to say that it was pretty much of a ho-hum. Some of there were a couple of moments where each candidate kind of distinguished themselves. I would say certainly David Yaskey coming out against the hundreds of millions of dollars in city council discretionary funding jumped out at me because that was a departure.
And there's a clip of that. Let's listen to that clip right now.
I think the practice of allowing council members to distribute discretionary funds is a bad idea. It's too open to waste and abuse and even, as you allude to, criminality.
Yeah, that was quite something.
So explain that to us.
Well, historically, the city council, and this goes back long before the current speaker, had this practice of hundreds of millions of dollars that went to various nonprofits. Now, where the scandal came in is when the U.S. attorney started looking at allegations of misappropriation, where specifically two city council staffers had moved money out of one of these discretionary funds to some offshore account to benefit relatives. And that sent into, a whole slide of investigation. And then looking at this long-term process of using so-called placeholders where they weren't even real names of organizations. Christine Quinn, the speaker, inherited this situation, tried to turn around with compliance, but still, we had another councilman, Martinez, just recently plead out. It really opened up a whole world, and then we found out even about mayor discretionary funds. So Yaskey really did make a break with the pastor in the status quo on that. Now,
because the comptroller has always had the ability to oversee these funds.
If it's city funds, he could audit it.
Traditionally,
right.
and we all know that when it comes to politics, politicians tend to sort of not look too closely at each other's pots of money, especially when you may want people's support in an upcoming election. And that's just not the current occupant of the office. That's probably the whole history of the comptroller's office.
Right. We still don't even know.
So Yaskey is saying, I would break from the past. I would take away these pots of money.
And he couldn't take it away. In point of fact, we have to be clear that a lot of these things that people are talking about are things they might want to do. I mean, we heard David Weprin talk about one of the big problems we have is at least a $5 to $6 billion budget gap ahead next year. And he was talking about taxing commuters, which is something he couldn't do of his own right. But
let's hear that clip now.
I think the answer really here is to bring back the old commuter tax. When we had a commuter tax, people that spent their day in New York City benefited from services, whether it be police, fire, transportation, sanitation. They should all pay a fair share.
So the commuter tax is an interesting issue to push for, especially from, David Weprin from Queens, who, some people in Queens identify themselves as commuters, although they wouldn't necessarily be subject to this tax. We're talking about people from outside New York City who work in New York City who used to be subject to a tax, who aren't now.
My father paid it for years and never complained.
Well, no one noticed it because
exactly.
It was, 45 cents a...
And as things there's less options now as we head into this prolonged period of time of downturn. I mean, we still have these foreclosure issues, we have record unemployment, so it's not bouncing back right away. They're going to have to be looking for different revenue sources. So it gives you more a sense of the sensitivity of the comptroller. Now, in the case of Councilwoman Katz, she, there's been a lot of discussion about how the current occupant of the office of the comptroller, Bill Thompson, relied on private equity managers. And the Times did this major story that said that the pension fund underperformed, and yet they increased the use of these pension managers. Well, Katz says, well, let's go back and get the fees that these underperforming money managers got paid from the city.
And let's hear Melinda Katz.
I would start in going back to those companies and saying to those companies, you want to continue investing from our city? You want to make sure that you continue with your funds to get our money? Where are the fees that you got from the city of New York? Give them back, and then we can continue negotiations.
So she's saying she's going to get tough on these management companies.
Well, I don't know how you're exactly going to do that, but it sets a tone. The idea is that she's going to roll up her sleeves and face off against the moneyed interests. And in a race where you're going to see so few voters turn out.
Interestingly, I mean, one of the major criticisms of Melinda Katz in her role as a city council person and head of the land use committee is that she's in fact not done that. She says, she's represented the best interests of the cities, but as the head of the land use committee, there's been some criticism that hasn't had enough of an arm's length.
In fact, the Times referred to this in an endorsement of David Yaskey about her proximity to real estate interests.
All right, let's listen to a clip from John Liu, and then let's bring in Erin Einhorn to talk about her story that she did. Here's Liu at Sunday's debate.
Finally, the comptroller has a say in the single largest budget item in our city's budget. I will use the audit powers to review the contracts, particularly the no-bid contracts, with an eye towards saving millions of dollars for the schools, for the classrooms.
So what is John Liu talking about?
Well, that's
there?
actually a kind of breakthrough where in Albany, one of the things that did come through with their iteration of mayoral control was the role of having the controller oversee the Department of Education, which has been a parallel fiscal universe. Even though it's over $20 billion, it kind of audits itself. So the next controller, whoever wins this election, is going to have the opportunity to roll their sleeves up. Of particular focus is some $2 billion in non-bid contracts the DOE has had that have been quite controversial.